In the Battlefield games, there's a lot of different aspects that make up a player's loadout, and of course, one of those main aspects is the gadget slot, providing some unique pieces of equipment to complement a soldier's role, and give them something else to use, to help teammates out and provide assistance. There's a pretty massive variety of gadgets that have appeared over the years, letting you do all sorts of different things depending on your class. But obviously, because there's a big combination of both constructive and destructive gadgets that have made their way into the pile, there's also quite a few that tend to grind people's gears more than the others, generally being more annoying to be up against. Whether that's because they feel a bit too powerful, unavoidable, or noob friendly, or maybe it's because they're just simply used by a hell of a lot of players, and can be quite frustrating to be taken down by several times during a match. The Battlefield series definitely has its fair share of hated gadgets, which tend to get on people's nerves a tad more than the others. And it's some of these loadout options that we're going to be taking a look at today in this video. Here's my top 10 list of annoying gadgets in the Battlefield games. So kicking the list off with our 10th place gadget, the CS gas launcher from Battlefield Hardline. This comes in the form of two variants in the game, the M320 for the cops and the M79 for the criminals, but both play out in the exact same way, and both can be a great big pain in the arse, especially if there's a few guys on the other team that have decided to use them against you. This gadget functions a little bit like a typical grenade launcher, but instead of firing out explosives, it shoots out projectiles that emit clouds of tear gas, that puts you in a bit of an awkward state and makes you really vulnerable. Think about how annoying suppression is, and then times that by about 10. The gas grenades can be really problematic, because they pretty much completely blur your entire screen, making it a lot harder to see anything in front of you. Not to mention that they also double any damage you take at the same time too. So not only do you feel like you've lost your contact lenses, but if a couple of stray bullets fly in your direction, it's often going to be lights out for you. Not the best position to be in the middle of a frantic gun battle. Those gas canisters are best launched at enemies inside buildings and within tight spaces, where they've got little room to escape. And unlike in Battlefield 1, where just about anyone can counter the gas at any time by slapping on a mask, the only way to get around it in Hardline is by equipping a special gas mask gadget, which is going to take up one of your slots, and sort of obstruct your view a bit, making it a less favourable choice. Gas in the Battlefield games is always annoying to be up against, and this launcher makes it even more so. The next gadget in the list might not seem like a particularly annoying thing for the average player, especially if you tend to run around with your rifle, ignoring the vehicles most of the time. But if you're a chopper pilot, then you're gonna come up against a pretty frustrating gadget called the AA mine. This featured in Battlefield 4's Naval Strike expansion, and is essentially a drop-and-forget missile launcher that locks onto aircraft and launches anti-air projectiles at them when in range. The user doesn't really have to do anything for it to be effective, other than to plop it down in an area that helicopters and jets are likely to fly over, which is pretty much anywhere on most of the maps, as the gadget's going to do most of the work for you. It's basically the anti-air gadget for lazy people, who can't be bothered dealing with the choppers themselves. They're not quite as effective as some of the launchers, but a direct hit will still cause your enemy's vehicle to lose control and dish out some mobility damage, potentially making them crash into the side of a building. Unlucky for them. I guess you could argue that the air vehicles in Battlefield 4 deserve an equally annoying counter, because for infantry mains, choppers are pretty bloody annoying in that game. But considering this gadget takes no skill to use and can be very deadly in a lot of circumstances, and considering the guy in the chopper probably waited friggin' ages to be able to spawn into said chopper, the AA mine is still a very hated thing amongst vehicle players, especially when it first became available, with engineers being able to carry 2 of them. For a series that's really struggled in the past with grenade spam issues, the next gadget in the list doesn't exactly make things any better. In 8th place is the rifle grenade, from a few of the games set around the World Wars, which is basically a gadget that lets you carry more nades and launch them even further than normal. Equipping this gadget basically gives you a few extra bombs to lob at your enemies, and on some of the maps with lots of small interiors, corridors and trenches, this can be a bit of a nuisance, along with all the other stuff that everyone's chucking at you too. It doesn't always guarantee kills, but it does force players to run away, flushing them out of certain areas and routes, and because it's pretty much essential on some of the game modes to pass through said areas and routes, the rifle grenade can often be a source of a lot of unavoidable deaths, while players try to defend objectives, take over key areas, and make their way through some really nasty choke points. Having to constantly avoid explosions all the time can be quite frustrating, especially on modes like Breakthrough where everyone's much closer together, channeled into hectic action zones. And with the rifle grenade launcher being a pretty easy to use, noob-friendly gadget that a lot of players like to equip, it's definitely one of the more hated things in the Battlefield games, along with Battlefield 1's crossbow launcher too, which pretty much does the exact same thing, but for the support class instead, once again contributing to that grenade spam issue even more. So in 7th place on the list is one of those gadgets that can be pretty fun to use, but an absolute bitch to be taken down by. The sticky dynamite in Battlefield 5. This plays out in a very similar way to a lot of the other remote detonated explosions that we've seen in the past games, like the standard dynamite and C4. But the reason why this one takes the cake for being a more annoying alternative is because of the fact that it can be thrown a lot further than before, making it a hell of a lot easier and safer to use. And of course because it sticks to surfaces, making it a perfect little gadget for setting up traps. In the past games, these kind of explosions were primarily used for blowing up unsuspecting vehicles from behind, by sneaking up at them at a very short range. In Battlefield 5 though, although the sticky dynamite is also pretty good at doing that too, it's now a lot more effective at killing other soldiers, because of that stronger throwing distance. If there's an enemy sat behind some cover, lob some dynamite at them. If there's a guy chilling out in a room waiting for you to walk on through, lob some dynamite at them. If there's a bunch of guys running up through a narrow choke point, lob some of that bloody dynamite at them. It can be far more effective than the standard frag grenades, with you being able to detonate it a lot quicker. And because the dynamite serves a lot of purposes, it tends to feature on a lot of assault player loadouts, having tons of destructive power that can wreck buildings and obliterate cover, and anyone who happens to be standing behind it. It's a very common thing to be killed by in Battlefield 5, and a lot of the time, it can be a very hard thing to avoid. Further down the list now at number 6 is a very deadly gadget from Battlefield 1 that causes quite a lot of frustrating deaths: the AT rocket gun. This is basically a very angry tube of metal that fires out explosive shells, and as the name implies, it's mainly designed to put holes in vehicles, being an anti-tank weapon. It's pretty good at being a bit of a menace towards vehicle players, because its projectiles can travel reasonably quickly over a fairly long distance, making it quite an easy gadget to use. The rocket gun does have to be mounted onto a surface first, which can sometimes be a bit of an inconvenience, but otherwise it's capable of dishing out quite a lot of explosive damage per blast, which can be useful in a lot of scenarios. This very same explosive power used to give vehicle players a hard time is also often used to give other soldiers a hard time too, because although it's not exactly designed for taking down people, it's still really damn effective against them too. Arguably a little bit too effective at times. It's practically a one-hit kill cannon against other infantry players. Even the elite kit blokes running around with all the armour on can still be wiped out in one blast from the good old trusty rocket gun. It's just that strong. A lot of assault players favour this gadget because of that high power, and although it can be a trickier thing to use over longer distances, it's still capable of taking on snipers and finishing off weakened players very easily, so it's quite a common gadget to be killed by as you play. Right in the middle of the list now at number 5 is one of the less dangerous gadgets in the list that can be quite annoying for the opposite reasons to a lot of the others: the ballistic shield, which can often piss people off in a totally different way. This thing doesn't really frustrate players because of its lethality, it instead frustrates them because it stops them from being able to kill their opponents. The shield first appeared in Battlefield 4 and allowed players to travel around the maps and through dangerous areas a bit more safely. It also meant that if you were to get yourself cornered, a guy with a shield could walk right up to you and bash you in the face while being somewhat protected, which wouldn't be a very fun way to go out. The ballistic shield wasn't overly hated in Battlefield 4, but it did become more annoying when it came back later on in Battlefield Hardline, because along with it playing out in a similar way to before, it was now useful even when it wasn't being used. Unlike the last shield, this one acted as a big, almost bulletproof plate stuck to your back, helping to protect you from incoming fire from behind, when it wasn't being held. It was pretty typical to start shooting at someone running away, only for them to be completely protected by that friggin' shield, just because they've got it equipped on the loadout. Not to mention the fact that the hardline shield was also a lot more resistant to explosions too, and it was generally a much more common thing to see. Coming in at 4th place is probably one of the noobiest noob tubes of the lot: the XM25 grenade launcher, equipped with those airburst projectiles. This thing is a bit of a bastard in Battlefield 4, especially on some of the close quarter maps and areas, like on Operation Locker, because the grenades you fire out can explode near targets and cover pieces, preventing your enemies from regaining health as they hide out of sight. The XM25 is capable of spamming these explosions at your enemies, which can literally be impossible to avoid at times. The gadget doesn't exactly take a hell of a lot of skill to master, because you don't really need to be very accurate, and it can often perform effectively as an individual weapon, as opposed to being something that's just there to supplement your loadout, like most of the other gadgets. The fact that this thing can kill people you can't even see is a pretty wild thing to have in the game, especially with it dealing such a generous amount of splash damage, because of the airburst mechanic. This is often more than enough to get on people's nerves, making it a pretty damn annoying thing to be taken out by, down to its effectiveness and down to it being such an easy thing to use. The XM25's explosions aren't going to deal a crazy amount of damage on their own, but because you can spam the trigger and fire off a few grenades in a fairly short space of time, that'll often get the job done fine enough regardless, leaving your targets heavily suppressed as they frantically try and scramble around to get to safety. Definitely one of Battlefield's more annoying gadgets. Speaking of getting wiped out by people you can't bloody see, next up in the list is the mortar gadget, one of the most brainless things you could possibly want to use. There aren't as many deaths that feel quite as cheap as getting killed by someone sitting around in a safe place, literally just placing bombs on people's heads from an aerial view of the map. Using the mortar in Battlefield games require next to no skill at all, just luck and a general knowledge of your enemy's position. That's it. The mortar gadget pops up in a few of the games, with slight variations in the way it works, but it generally has the same purpose in them all, to rain down unavoidable explosions from the sky, to kill targets and disrupt their movement, and their fun. On game modes like Rush and Operations, where players are channeled down specific routes and narrow lanes, this gadget can be a complete pest. There's usually no way to counter the attack or even see it coming in the first place. You'll often just randomly get bombarded with shells while you go about your business, and there's not much you can really do about it either. A lot of people will argue that it's a tactical gadget that serves a specific purpose, but a lot of others will probably tell you that it's a gadget designed for filthy casuals, that would rather sit around all day plotting points on the map to get kills, rather than actually playing the game and taking them on in a fair fight. So in second place is the Piat rocket launcher in Battlefield 5. One of the most notorious gadgets of the lot, down to how good it is at sending people back to the spawn screen. The Piat is arguably one of the most deadliest launchers in the series, because of its extremely high damage output and its very generous splash radius, allowing it to outright obliterate a lot of its victims in just one shot. Because a lot of the players in Battlefield 5 are running around with lower amounts of health, with attrition limiting how much they can regenerate, this gives the Piat even more of an advantage, making its targets easy pickings. And if someone scurries off behind a wall or in a building, then they're definitely still not safe from that destructive power. Aiming the projectiles can be a little bit trickier to judge over longer distances, down to them flying slower and being a bit more affected by gravity, but in most cases this can be easily countered by just aiming a tad higher, and the benefits you'll reap from those heftier explosions far outweighs the gadget's drawbacks. For this reason, the Piat is a go-to gadget for a hell of a lot of assault players, so you're often going to be a victim of its devastating power in a lot of matches. Some people will quite literally just switch to this thing in the middle of a gunfight, rather than trying to take you on with their primary weapon, because it can often be a more effective thing to do. Everybody hates getting killed by the Piat, vehicle players and infantry alike, so it makes very good sense to add it to the list. A lot of you guys probably won't be massively surprised to see what's popped up in first place, the planted explosive, which comes in the form of different things in different games, but all generally do the same job across them all. The tripwire bombs, AP mines and claymores are all drop and forget gadgets simply designed to stop people dead in their tracks, and pad out the user's kill count a bit. It's the ultimate camper tool to ruin enemy flanks, prevent people from getting around, and to test the patience of anyone who happens to accidentally walk into one. Because there's nothing quite as annoying as getting unexpectedly killed by some random explosion caused by someone who's pretty much just plopped a gadget down and wandered off. No matter which game you play, planted anti-infantry mines are always going to seem very frustrating to be killed by, and because they appear in some form or another in most of the Battlefield games, this makes them a very common thing to quite literally run into. Most of them do have some kind of giveaway, like visible tripwires, but let's be honest, the last thing you're usually going to be looking out for in a game full of dangerous things is a couple of little black lines at the bottom of your screen, especially if you tend to rush enemy positions and like to play aggressively. I guess if I was going to narrow this down even further to an ultimate choice, I'd probably say that the Claymore is the most annoying one of the bunch, because it's usually always going to be a one-hit kill, and it pretty much detonates immediately after you trigger it, giving you no way to escape its explosion. But generally speaking, they're all a pain in the arse to be taken down by, and they all net cheap kills for the user by not really doing anything. So that's my list of annoying Battlefield gadgets, but which ones do you think are the most frustrating to be killed by? Let me know your choices down below in that comment section. Remember to subscribe and apply all notifications if you want to be the first to see new content in the future, and be sure to check out the channel to see anything you might have missed along the way. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.